So, good morning, everyone. Again, glad to see that there's some new folks here, some folks who have been here before. We're obviously a couple past 10, so we're just going to get into it now. For folks who might not know, my name's Ashley White. I'm a senior policy researcher at MTF. MTF is a nonpartisan, nonprofit public policy research organization. This is the third installment of our budget presentations on early education and care. We started off with the governor's budget, then moved on to the House, and now we're providing a briefing on the Senate budget. So hopefully you all are in the right place, because that's what we'll be talking about today. As I've mentioned before, the purpose of these presentations, I think first and foremost, is for us to be a helpful resource to folks on this particular topic. My colleague Megan is on the call as well, and we'll be doing a similar presentation on K through 12. So if that's of interest to you, that would be tomorrow morning, same time. But really, we want to be a helpful resource. At the same time, though, I think we also want to be able to, expand our reach as an organization. And so if anyone is, interested in getting to know MTF more about our work or what we do, please feel free to reach out afterwards. So let's get going here. So I'm going to start with some definitions. I did this last time. I'm not going to walk through all of them, but I think just helpful to make sure that we're all on the same page. And if folks, of course, have questions, feel free to reach out in the midst of the presentation. We're going to start with a little bit of the background on kind of the fiscal conditions in Massachusetts. I think a lot has changed, has happened since the last time we met. And so want to provide some additional context there. And then we're going to provide a pretty high-level overview of the Senate budget and how that kind of compares to what the House did, maybe some similarities or differences with the governor's budget as well, before really kind of diving into what's going on with early education and care. So these are the definitions. Happy to add if folks have suggestions on what to add. Again, I'm not going to go through all these. I think the big ones I want to just highlight here is the one at the top, ARPA, right? That's the American Rescue Plan Act. That was that federal COVID relief bill. Massachusetts got a lot of different types of resources from that bill, and so I'll be referencing that. I also want to mention surtax. So this is a term I'm probably going to use quite frequently. What I'm referring to is the Fair Share Amendment, right? Those revenues from the Fair Share Amendment, which was the 4% tax on income above $1 million. So when I say surtax, I mean those revenues. And then the last one is the transitional escrow account, right? Basically, as folks know, right, we had a lot of tax revenue growth over the past 2 years. So we had surplus tax revenues at the end of the fiscal year. We put those in a transitional escrow account. And so when I refer to that, I'm talking about surplus tax revenues. But again, not going to go through the rest, but feel free to kind of peruse. Okay, so into the FY23 fiscal update here. So I think as folks may have heard, might know, April was not a great revenue month for Massachusetts. And so in May, which was the most recent tax revenue month, we rebounded kind of slightly from that $1.2 billion drop that we saw in revenues year to date in April. And so what I mean by kind of year-to-date benchmark is, I think I've explained this to folks before, right? At the beginning of the fiscal year, really smart people kind of get together and say, okay, what do we think we're going to collect over this fiscal year in terms of tax, resources? And then let's try to build a budget around kind of the available resources that we have. And so what happened kind of is that we were not kind of performing at this juncture, kind of how we expected we were going to perform at this point. In May, we made up some of that loss, right? So in May, we're about $999 million below that year-to-date revenue benchmark. So we're $999 million below where we thought we were going to be at this point in the year. But we did make up some ground, right? And so we're about $200 million closer to where we thought we were going to be than we were in April. So made up some ground, although a small amount. Those April revenue drops were really kind of related to a decline in capital gains revenue and other non-withholding income, which was anticipated in FY23 and FY2024. And I'll talk about that a bit throughout this presentation. Didn't know kind of exactly when, but again, it was anticipated. So clearly jarring, but definitely expected. This does make, fiscal conditions in FY23 a bit more challenging, but it's not going to require late year cuts, right? And the kind of budget assumptions that we're using for the FY24 budget still remain kind of reasonable. There also remains 1.7 billion in one-time state surplus funds and state ARPA funds, which I talked about, right? Again, with all the kind of attention and sort of worry around kind of these sudden revenue kind of drops, it is important to note that tax relief proposals are impacting FY 2024, not FY 2023, which is the current fiscal year that we are in. So I think this slide really just tries to kind of put a visual into that first bullet that I talked about, right? So the blue bars is what we thought we were going to collect compared to FY 2023. That's the benchmark, right? What we expected to collect through the year. Yellow is what we actually collected compared to FY 2022. So again, you can see, right, that it was always expected that we weren't going to perform as good as we have in prior years, because in prior years we were performing well above kind of expectations. So you can see the yellow bar at the beginning half of the year is above the blue bar, right? And then we see kind of in April and May, we're seeing that yellow bar is now beyond that blue bar, right? So we're performing worse than we kind of expected to. But what do you see between April and May, right? You see that the yellow line is now closer to that blue bar, which means we made up some ground in May. Again, like I said, a small amount, but we did make up some ground in May in tax revenue collections. So again, yes, it looks scary, but clearly this was sort of expected, right? It was not a question of kind of if this was going to happen, but when this was gonna happen. So again, another slide, I think, to try to show you where have these declines in tax revenues been to date, right? As the gray bar across really kind of articulates for folks, they've been largely in non-withholding income, right? We see that date to growth in that category is 42% kind of below what we thought, right? So, and what else do we see, which is, I think, really important? We see that other tax revenues have kind of held steady, right, or kind of grown to date. We're seeing good sales tax revenue, income withholding tax revenue, right? So it's really kind of expected that we were going to see this non-withholding decline. And what kind of went into that non-withholding tax revenue decline? It was capital gains and this thing called pass-through entity excise taxes, which I'll talk about in a minute. But again, all sort of anticipated. So again, in terms of this being anticipated, when MTF did its revenue projections, we projected that through FY22 to FY 2024, we were going to see these declines, right? We estimated that they were going to see about a 47% drop in capital gains revenue and a 37% drop in other non-withholding income. That's pretty darn close to where things are, currently. Now, is there a chance that things could kind of shift in ways that we didn't anticipate? Like, sure, I think we always need to leave ourselves open to that. But I think at least, at this juncture, why you see kind of no dramatic changes in budget decisions or dramatic changes in policy is because these declines are really kind of explicable in projections of ours, but also in the projections of other folks who are really kind of experts in this area. So to talk a little bit more about kind of the capital gains and the PT excise credits, again, I don't want to kind of get too far in the weeds for folks, but hopefully just want to share kind of high level why we were expecting this. Capital gains, right? Through the last 2 years, we had kind of unprecedented tax revenue growth, particularly in this capital gains category. I think it was pretty anticipated that as markets normalized, right, we just weren't going to be able to, we weren't going to kind of keep up with that tax collection growth and wouldn't be able to keep up with that pace. And so as the markets have normalized, we've seen a decline in that revenue. At the same time, the state had an outstanding liability that they knew was going to come into play at some point. Again, it wasn't about kind of an if thing, but it was about when are we going to see this? Basically, they came in the form of these, pass-through entity excise tax credits, right? And again, I don't want to kind of get into the weeds here, but we saw this kind of growth in tax revenue, right? But we knew a portion of that was going to have to kind of go back out the door because we had these folks involved in pass-through entities that were going to claim tax credits, right? And that were on the books that they just hadn't claimed. So perhaps unsurprising, right? April came, which is sort of tax time, right? And folks filed their taxes, and we had a bunch of people claim these credits, right? And so that has a lot to do with what we saw in April as well. So hopefully that kind of explains some of what was going on behind the scenes in April, and partially what we see in May. This is another slide I hope to help folks. I've done this slide, we've done this slide before, but I think is really important now given what happened in April and May. So even though, right, we're not performing as well as we thought we were going to, the good news is that we are kind of better off than we were pre-pandemic, right? So what this yellow line is saying is if we grew at 5% growth, which we were doing before the pandemic, we would still be we are better than that yellow line. As you can see, right, the blue bars go above the yellow line. And so we're in better shape than if we had just grown at 5% over the past few years, which is what we were growing at before the pandemic. So some folks who have been to these presentations have seen this slide a few times now, right? We've basically got about $1.4 billion in surplus tax revenues that are sitting in that transitional escrow account. These dollars can be used in a myriad of ways, right? And they're really the result of that kind of exponential tax revenue growth that we had over the past few years, right? We were taking in more money than we could spend, and so we put some away in this transitional escrow account. We've also got $300 million remaining in these federal fiscal recovery funds, right? These are also flexible dollars, right, from the American Rescue Plan Act. But they're different than the surplus revenues because there are strings attached, right? They've got to be spent by a certain date. They've got kind of requirements about where they can be spent. And so important to kind of note the two differences, but I think as a whole, hopefully gives some folks here a good picture of kind of the quote unquote savings or additional resources that we do have available at this point in time. Which kind of brings me to the next slide, which is kind of combining all of the resources that we do have available, right? So this kind of chart includes those surplus tax dollars in gray. We've also got money in different trust funds, right? So we've got some money in a Student Opportunity Act trust fund. We've got some funds in an Early Education and Care trust fund. And then we have the stabilization fund balance, which is that dark blue line, right? And that is, I think I've said to folks before, it's basically like the rainy day fund for the state. It's a savings account. It's an emergency kind of savings account. And so a portion like that stabilization fund balance is basically made up of capital gains revenue. So a portion of capital gains revenue that comes to the state has to be automatically deposited into that stabilization fund balance. And so it's probably no surprise to folks that that balance has grown quite a bit over the past few years as we've seen kind of that capital gains revenue increase. So just wanted to give folks a good sense of kind of the other resources that are out there as well. So now want to move on to the Senate budget and kind of provide a bit of a high level overview as to what's going on there before we get into the early ed items. So as folks might remember, when the House filed their budget, they did file companion tax relief legislation. The Senate didn't take the same approach, but they instead set aside about $575 million to cover the FY 2024 costs of that future legislation. Now we've obviously seen the Senate has come out with their tax plan. It's pretty close to that figure. The Senate budget does use income surtax revenue for a variety of different unique priorities. Very similar to the House, the Senate is creating a structure to collect and track and spend income surtax revenue. Again, pretty much identical to the House. There are some key differences, which I'll talk about in a moment. And then again, perhaps a little bit different from the House, the Senate is like really relying on trust fund resources for about $437 million in trust fund resources to support early education and the behavioral health workforce. And this is a theme that I think you're going to see throughout the Senate budget, is that they are using far more trust fund resources than perhaps previous proposed budgets. The Senate budget also includes 91 outside policy sections. So wanted to start just with Senate debate here to give folks a glimmer into kind of what happened. So as folks know, right, the Senate Ways and Means budget comes out, then there's a Senate debate. Senators kind of adopt and reject and withdraw kind of amendments. And through those days of debate, basically the Senate added 82 million in new spending and 34 outside policy sections, right? That got added to the Senate Ways and Means budget. A large portion of that additional money came in the form of earmarks. So you can see on the graph, right, the yellow is earmark spending, the blue is non-earmark spending. So about 72 million in new spending came from earmarks, and about 10 million of it came from non-earmark spending. This is just Senate kind of big picture spending, right? Comparing the Senate budget to the budget last year, to the governor's budget, to the House budget, right? So very big picture, right? It's looking at mass health spending and then basically all other line items, all of those line items. So I think the big picture here is that the Senate budget is spending about $499 million more than the House. However, again, this theme of trust funds is coming up, right? That the Senate, basically, of that 499 million, 437 million of it is attributed to the use of trust fund resources, right? That the House did not use. Another thing that I think is just important to note here, you can see mass health spending in the middle column of this chart grew at about 2%, and all of their line items grew at about 9%. I think in previous years you may have seen that kind of flip, right? The opposite be true. But I just want to note here that kind of 9% spending growth on all other kind of line items in the budget is probably not something that we're going to be able to kind of keep up with long term, right? That is a pretty high growth rate compared to where we typically see ourselves. So just wanted to highlight that for folks. Again, a chart of kind of big picture spending. How does the Senate kind of compare to the House, right? So you can see, right, Senate spending more money on healthcare, on early education, on transportation, right? I think one important thing, though, to note here, or actually two important things to note here. One is the early education, right? You see that there's a $220 million difference between what the Senate's doing and what the House did. The majority of that difference is in iLottery, right? So the House wants to use iLottery revenues to support C3, but their budget didn't necessarily appropriate that. And so the difference isn't kind of accounted for here. But if you account for that, right, that they intend to use iLottery revenues for C3, the difference is really only 20 million. The same other thing I want to highlight is K through 12, right? Looks like Senate is spending way less on the House, the K through 12. A majority of that is in universal school meals, right? House funds universal school meals, Senate does not. This really just trying to articulate how the Senate kind of proposes managing and tracking and organizing surtax revenues. I think, I don't want to kind of get into the weeds here. I think the bottom line is that it's very similar to what the House is doing, right? There's going to be a spending cap every year. There's going to be 3 funds of the revenue is going to be deposited into those. Those funds have kind of different purposes for what that money can be spent on. I think one of the kind of bigger differences is the Senate's plan provides a bit more details around the Innovation and Capital Fund. So again, the House proposal is very similar in that there's these 3 funds that money goes into, right? But the House called the Education and Transportation Innovation and Capital Fund just the Innovation Fund, right? And they also didn't provide details about kind of what happens to that money once it's deposited in the fund. What can you spend it on? What should it go towards? The Senate basically calls it the Innovation and Capital Fund, and then provides some details about what is meant, how that money is meant to be used. And they detail that it should be used on kind of one-time capital projects. So if we look at surtax spending and we compare what the governor did to the House, to the Senate, we can see they're each using, right, that $1 billion surtax revenue kind of cap. And they're all pretty clearly close to almost exactly a 50-50 split between education and transportation. I think the biggest differences here are kind of much like the governor. The Senate is focusing on higher ed. The House is really focused on MBTA. And again, the big difference in kind of the K through 12 funding has to do with the Universal School Meals Program. So looking ahead to conference, so what this chart is trying to do is basically look at all the spending across the House, across the Senate, and determine what's unique kind of to each branch, right? And what are some shared priorities? Because the purpose is to kind of determine what the gaps are between the two. So of that kind of $1 billion cap, right? About 449 million of it is shared across both branches, right? We see that in the kind of middle column, it's shared spending. Then you've also got, though, $551 million, which are unique to the House, and then $551 million, which is unique to the Senate, right? So that basically means that right now, between both budgets, we've got about $1.5 billion in spending, but we can actually only spend $1 billion, right? So this is going to make kind of conference committee tricky when it comes to surtax revenues. I think that might sound perhaps alarming for people, right? We've got to cut, $500 million. How are we going to do that? What programs is that going to be? Obviously, I understand kind of why folks might be alarmed by that. Though I think it's really important to note that, a lot of these investments are totally new programs, right? And so there's a bit more flexibility to kind of adjust or change spending on those, and without having to necessarily kind of impact existing funding levels for existing programs. But they do have, I think, some interesting conversations ahead about how to kind of reconcile these two spending plans. So I'm going to go into now really focus on the early education and care budget and what the Senate is doing there. Top 5 things to know, the takeaways from the Senate budget. It's $1.5 billion for early education and care. The Senate is appropriating $475 million for C3 stabilization grants. According to kind of historic spending trends, that fully funds the program for FY 2024. The Senate is using surtax revenues on early education, but they are not dedicating them towards C3 grants. Compared to the House, the Senate is dedicating more funding for subsidies, but is doing less for reimbursement rate increases. And also the Senate does not legalize online lottery and dedicate those resources to C3, which the House proposal does. So I want to start off with the kind of amendments and Senate debate. Not too much kind of going on in terms of early ed here. We had 7 different amendments proposed. 3 of those were adopted. 2 of those were earmarks, and 1 of them increased line item spending. And basically the overall kind of bottom line increase was $800,000 to the EEC budget. So some of the details, what amendments were adopted versus what amendments were rejected or withdrawn, right? We had a $450,000 earmark for Jumpstart. We had an increase to Parent Child Plus program, and we also had a $100,000 earmark for the City of Boston infant mental health training for educators. Had about 4 amendments that were either rejected or withdrawn. 1 was an increase to Reach Out to Read. There were some increases to kind of the Children's Trust Fund, and then there was also a proposed increase to reimbursement rates. So this is kind of a table that tries to kind of summarize the major investments in early education and care. As I mentioned, the Senate funds the EEC at $1.5 billion. This is, $330 million more than the FY23 enacted budget. I think the FY23 budget broached that $1 billion mark for the first time ever. And now it looks like, we're going to have an EEC budget that exceeds that historic mark, kind of no matter what. I'm going to just talk through, I think, some key differences, but first, I again just wanted to note the difference, right? That the chart kind of indicates that the difference between the Senate and the House is that $221 million. Again, 200 of that has to do with iLottery. And so if you account for those resources that are intended to go to early ed, the difference between the House and the Senate is really negligible kind of overall. Again, going to walk through some of the kind of key differences between the 2 plans, but I think at a high level, the differences are really have to do with how they utilize surtax revenue and trust fund resources, how they deal with reimbursement rates and subsidy accounts, and again, how they utilize those trust fund resources. The Senate plan also, again, does not include legalizing iLottery and dedicating those revenues to C3, as I've said before. So this just looks at kind of surtax spending, but also trust fund spending, and tries to put them kind of together in a table, right? So you can see that the Senate is using surtax revenues on a variety of different kind of programs, but not for C3. And instead, they decide that they're going to dedicate $245 million from that early ed trust fund and put those towards C3 instead. And so again, this is part of that like larger theme of the Senate really tapping into some of those trust fund resources to support funding for some of these programs. Also at the bottom is the Behavioral Health Trust Fund. So there's about $5 million in the EEC budget for early childhood mental health. $2.5 million of those resources come from this Behavioral Health Trust Fund. Two other things I just want to highlight here, which are a little bit unique to the Senate. They choose to use surtax revenues on a new program for provider capital grants, right? So these are grants that would go out to providers for them to kind of improve their infrastructure, expand their infrastructure so that they can serve more children. This program would be administered by the EEC. This is entirely different than the Early Education at a School Time Capital Fund, which folks might be familiar with. Happy to answer questions if folks have any around the differences between the two, but just wanted to know that this is a kind of direct appropriation that would go to the EEC to issue grants for capital improvements for childcare providers across the state. The Senate also uses surtax revenue to support a pilot program, existing pilot program for financial assistance for educators. So this is right to help educators afford their own childcare, afford their own childcare costs. The House actually supports funding this program as well at $10 million, but does not use surtax revenue for it. The Senate supports funding it at $15 million and uses those surtax revenue resources. So moving on to subsidy investments here. So as folks probably know, right, there's two line items dedicated to subsidies in the state budget, right? There's one for income eligible care, and there's one that combines funding for childcare for children and families who are involved in the Department of Transitional Assistance, or they're involved with the Department of Children and Families. And so across those two line items, right, the Senate is proposing about an $800 million investment, and this includes the $25 million for reducing the income eligible wait list with surtax revenues. I combine those because I think ultimately those resources are going to go towards trying to issue more subsidies to serve more children and get them off of the wait list. So the kind of Senate proposal is about $80 million over last year's enacted budget, and it's about $60 million over the House budget. And so those are the differences, and you can see that on the chart there. So for reimbursement rates, as I said, right, the Senate is providing more for subsidies compared to the House, but they are providing less for rate increases compared to the House. Before we do get kind of into the numbers, I just wanted to clarify, I think, the differences in terms of where this money sits in line items in case folks go looking for it and have difficulty finding it. So historically speaking, for a while, there was one sort of line item for reimbursement rates, and it was the center-based reimbursement line item. It's 3,1042 in case anyone wants to check it out. What the governor did was create basically a new line item that said it was explicitly for center-based childcare providers, but also family childcares. And then they put $20 million in that new account. What the House decided to do was they wanted to divide their investments for reimbursement rates across those two line items, the historic one and then the new one created by the governor. So there's, in the House budget, there's $20 million in the new one, and there's $80 million in the old one, and that totals to $100 million, as you can see in the graph. The Senate chose to just match the governor's approach and invested $20 million in that new line item. One thing I also just want to highlight here, which I'll try to talk about a couple of times, is, as you notice on the slide, it says that it's $70 million less for reimbursement rates. So the difference between the House, right, is it says 80, but there's actually a $10 million earmark in the House's spending proposal. That's the $10 million earmark for that financial assistance for early educators. And so the true difference in terms of what they're spending on reimbursement rates is $70 million when you account for that earmark. And you'll see that reflected on this chart. So this is basically combining the kind of subsidy line items with the rate reserve and looking at kind of the subsidy system as a whole. How are we funding the subsidy system, right? So in terms of overall kind of funding across subsidies and rates, the difference between the House and the Senate is marginal, right? It's if you account for that earmark, it's $10 million, right? And so it's just about really where they're choosing to spend those dollars that kind of sets the House and the Senate proposal apart. So as I mentioned earlier, right, Senate is doing more for subsidies while House is doing more for rates. What does this potentially mean? It's possible that the Senate plan allows for more access, right? While the House plan is really kind of focusing on the childcare workforce and providing funding for those reimbursement rates. But again, overall, the kind of big picture, there's really only a $10 million difference between the two plans. So wanted to just highlight some other notable investments, and sorry for the acronyms on this slide. The first one is the Child Care Resource and Referral, agencies. This is $20 million in the Senate's budget for that. That matches the governor and the House investments. I believe that is sort of the annualization of a $5 million earmark from last fiscal budget. Then there's $30 million for the Commonwealth Preschool Partnership Initiative. So this really kind of mirrors what the governor did, right? They're doubling investments in the CPPI because they're using $15 million from surtax revenues. There's also, increases in grants for Head Start programs. So this is matching the House investment and is about a $1 million increase over the FY23 budget. They're also providing $10 million for provider higher ed. This is flat compared to last fiscal year, and it also mirrors what the House and governor did. And then again, just wanted to highlight this early childhood mental health, right? We've got $5 million for that, which is the same as the governor and House, but does differ because it's using $2.5 million from that behavioral health trust fund. So I also wanted to go into some of the policy sections. So as folks may know, right, there's the section of the budget where it appropriates kind of dollars to different line items, which go to different programs to serve different initiatives. There's also what they call an outside section or a policy section. And that's really about kind of not necessarily direct appropriations, but is kind of changes to policy or additional legislative language that might change kind of existing law. And so there is an outside section in the Senate budget. It's outside Section 7 that covers some issues related to early education and care, and that is the price limitation law. I don't want to kind of go into the mechanics of it, though I'm happy to if folks have questions. But really, I think the big takeaway here is, what was this price limitation law doing? It was making it essentially kind of very difficult or kind of nearly impossible for childcare providers who accept subsidies to offer kind of meaningful discounts or free tuition to their kind of workers who are private pay, would-be private pay families. So again, happy to answer any questions on that, but that's the overall kind of impact of the policy. And so what the Senate does is they say, okay, we want to exempt the EEC from that price limitation law permanently. As of right now, the EEC has been receiving the annual waivers from this policy since 2020. I believe I heard that they may have gotten another extension for FY 2024, though I think the Operational Services Division has also kind of indicated that to the agency that this is not a permanent solution. And so I think what the Senate is trying to do is provide a permanent solution to allow the EEC to be exempt from this policy. And I think when you think about the kind of childcare workforce crisis right now and wanting to be able to attract educators and attract workers, I think this could be a really meaningful way to do that, is to be able to offer kind of discounted or free tuition to some of their workers. I think a notable thing that's not included, which was in the House budget, was the Section 30 in the House budget, which talked about C3 reporting requirements. It was pretty, expansive additions to kind of how we think about C3 and collect data regarding C3. The Senate budget did not include that outside section. However, they did include some reporting language in the actual C3 line item, which I'm going to talk about now. So I apologize that this isn't very pretty, but what this is on the right-hand side, what's happening is we're basically comparing the Senate language to the House language, right? And so in red is basically all those changes. You'll see some additional language. You'll see some language being struck. And so basically overall what's happening here is I think they're trying to get at the kind of essence of what was happening in Section 30 in the House budget, but is a little bit, is far less, I think, expansive as what the House was doing. But it is trying to get to this idea that, hey, C3 really affords us an opportunity to collect more data, to understand more about the system so that we can make meaningful improvements and start kind of thinking about doing that. And so overall, there are kind of three basic things that the changes kind of do. One is the Senate is requiring the EEC to collect program expenditure data, to collect kind of demographic data of the families and children that are served by providers who are participating in the program. It also strikes language that requires programs to respond to data requests to be eligible for C3. And it also allows the EEC to use some of these funds, right, to use some of that $475 million to support improved data collection. So, I think this is, again, getting at we should be collecting more data. I know that the agency is obviously regularly collecting data on C3 and able to understand a lot more about the system than we did before C3. But I think the legislature is really looking to, okay, how can we evolve that? How can we continue to collect more data? And so I think when you think about the kind of capacity of the EEC and the data systems that they have, and that some of this data might not kind of currently be collected or might not have kind of a way to collect this data, it's important to allow the agency to have some resources to improve those data collection efforts, expand upon those efforts. And so the Senate proposal does give them the flexibility to use some dollars for those purposes. So looking ahead now to conference committee, what can we perhaps expect? What are some kind of notable things that we should kind of keep in mind moving forward? This is the kind of budget timeline. I think folks have seen that, right? We're here. We're in June. We're in kind of the conference committee point in time. Typically, the budget is signed in July. I think there is some flexibility there as to kind of when that budget's going to be signed, given that there is a lot to kind of reconcile in this budget. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But in terms of the conference committee process, right? The conference committee consists of 6 members, right? It's 3 from the House and 3 from the Senate. There's the chairs of Ways and Means on both sides. There's a vice chair of Ways and Means on both sides. And then there's the ranking minority member of the Ways and Means committee. Once the kind of conference report is final, it's not like it's going to be amended. So it's not like it'll go to the House or Senate floor and they're going to kind of change things or be able to adapt things. It's a simple kind of yes or no vote on however they kind of reconcile the differences between the 2 budgets. The fiscal year technically, right, it starts on July 1, though I think as folks probably know, it's pretty common that the budget process in Massachusetts extends beyond that point in time. If this is the case, there is typically a temporary budget which allows existing programs to continue. So don't want folks to necessarily panic. Obviously, it's not ideal that we typically don't pass our budget at the start of the new fiscal year, but there are kind of systems in place to make sure that a temporary budget gets passed so that we can kind of allow those existing programs to continue. So this is trying to kind of provide an overview of what the conference committee kind of has ahead of itself, right? So the first step in conference negotiations is to really kind of determine all of the spending that has been proposed by the House, all of the spending that has been proposed by the Senate, and compare that to what are kind of the available resources. And then we can see, right, what's the gap between what we're proposing and what we actually have available to spend in this budget. So I think as the chart shows, the House budget included $5.6 billion, the Senate budget included $54.9 billion, right? A majority of those spending is shared, right? About 50, that next kind of row there, the majority of that is shared. 54 billion of that is spending that they have in common. However, next row down, right, the House has $591 million in unique spending. The Senate has $890 million in unique spending. And so if you were to kind of include all of the shared spending, all of the unique spending in the final budget, it would cost $55.5 billion, right? That's that maximum spending figure. Again, so as the chart kind of indicates, this excludes surtax spending that is completely separate from this process. And so MTF estimates that there's about $55 billion in resources available for the FY 2024 budget. Again, I think important to note, right? This is kind of MTF's estimates. These aren't figures that we're necessarily getting from the House or from the Senate, right? These are assumptions. I think they're very reasonable assumptions, very sane assumptions that are done by budget experts on our team. But I wanted to just clarify that these are kind of what we think are available in terms of maximum revenues is $55 billion. So what does that mean, right? We've got a maximum spending of $55.5 billion, and we've got maximum revenues of 55. The difference between the two is about 500 million, which means we've got to kind of reduce or cut some of the spending to fit into kind of the available resources that we have. I think This year is a bit different from the past years, right? We had this kind of unprecedented tax revenue growth. We had more resources than we actually needed to kind of fully have a fully funded budget. So I know this probably sounds kind of jarring or alarming, but this is a situation that I think was pretty typical pre-pandemic, right? This is a situation that I think budget makers are absolutely like prepared to handle and have experience handling. And this was really the kind of way of the world before the pandemic. So although it might be a shift from, I think, how conference committee may have gone in previous years, it is certainly something that I think budget experts are prepared to kind of handle. So I think the bottom line here is, right, we've got more spending that we have available resources. And so we've got to kind of figure out how to cut or reduce those resources. I will say that I think that budget makers really, I think, have a fair amount of options before them, right? In terms of how do we kind of shrink this gap and make sure that we don't have to cut 500 million. So for example, right, if they were to do iLottery, right, that knocks a couple $100 million off of the figure and makes the difference closer to 300 million. So there are kind of some ways in which we can shrink that difference. And again, it might sound alarming that we've got to find kind of $500 million to cut. But again, we have experience doing this and we've got some flexibility to be able to do it. This is just kind of showing kind of earmarks and wanting to kind of articulate for folks sort of how they kind of play into the conference committee process, right? I think this graph hopefully articulates for folks that we've seen a pretty steep increase in the number of earmarks that are adopted, both in the House budget and the Senate budgets over the past few years. Earmarks serve a really worthwhile purpose, right? But I think their growth really has the potential to take away resources from other statewide programs. And because a lot of the times earmark spending is kind of unique to the House or unique to the Senate, it can make conference committee a bit more difficult. And so as you see the kind of increase of those earmarks, it's possible that conference committee reconciliation gets more difficult along with that. So this is what did kind of conference committee-ish look like in FY 2023, right? So we have kind of what was the low number, what was the high number. These are just some of the investments I wanted to highlight, obviously not the whole budget here. Last year was a good year, right? Looks like the high number won out, majority of the time. Last year we had a lot more resources than what was being proposed. And so we had the kind of flexibility and capability to really maximize the different resources that were proposed. This year is different, right? It's a different kind of revenue picture. And also we've got iLottery to consider and we've got surtax to consider, and that complicates things a bit as well. So looking forward to kind of the FY24 conference committee, right? There's, as I've mentioned, right, there's this conference committee process is going to be a bit more complicated, right, than past recent years. One is about kind of the resources that we have available to spend, but the other is about kind of the differences in terms of the resources that are being kind of proposed in each budget. And this is, I think, perhaps not unique to early ed, but is certainly obviously clearly happening in the early ed section, which is that we've got kind of a variety of different ways in which the House and the Senate want to kind of support some of these programs, right? So we're using general fund resources, we're using surtax revenues, we're using kind of revenues that have been deposited in the early ed trust fund, right? And it's different depending on if it's the House or the Senate proposal. And so that complicates kind of how you reconcile those things. I think the other important thing to kind of note, or another kind of example of this, right, is that the House proposal seemingly, intends to fully fund C3 with the support of those iLottery revenues, but it does not appropriate those resources in their budget. That could complicate kind of how conference committee goes. Another example would be kind of this earmark thing, right? Where, okay, the House appropriated $10 million in an earmark for financial assistance. Well, the Senate wanted to fund that same program, but they're using surtax revenues for it, right? And so these kind of things are going to come into play throughout the conference committee process. And I think kind of just trying to articulate that there are some challenges ahead, but again, I think folks should know that certainly these things, budget makers have experience with these things, but again, this is a pretty unique year, just given the variety of resources that are available and the kind of available resources that are that we're able to use in general. So that is my presentation. I know that was a lot, so I appreciate your time and patience, and I'm happy to take any questions that folks might have now.
You have lots of questions in the chat, Ashley.
Okay.
Yes.
Megan, sorry, I can go back unless you have kind of them queued up, Megan.
Yes, I took notes as they were coming in. So the first question that we got was from Kate Marie. And she had a question about whether or not funds in the Education and Transportation Innovation and Capital Fund could be used for state level capital projects or for capital earmarks as well.
Yeah, you might have to chime in there, Megan. So my understanding is that that fund is for kind of one-time capital projects, and they use the term kind of pay-go, which I have learned means kind of resources that are already available, right? So capital projects with funds that we actually have available. In terms of the earmarks, Megan, I don't know if you kind of have an answer for that, but that's my understanding of what those resources should go towards.
Sure. Yeah. The only thing I would add is that there doesn't appear to be any specific language differentiating between whether they're state capital projects or if they could support capital earmarks as well.
Thank you.
Sure. Another question that we've gotten in the chat from Brian Dixon is, what are the implications of funding see-through stabilization grants with income surtax revenues versus trust fund resources, if there are any differences there?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I'm sure is probably on the mind of a lot of people. I think I'll try to answer that, and I hope this isn't too long-winded. I think from our standpoint, right, we believe that the state has the resources to fully fund C3 in FY 2024, and that level is probably upwards of $450 million, right, to annualize the cost of that program. And we think the state has the resources to do so. We're a bit agnostic as to how the state, what resources the state wants to use to do that, right? I think there are kind of, maybe not pros and cons, but there are things to kind of consider on both sides. But I think fortunately there are kind of solves for some of those considerations. So let's just talk about iLottery for a second, right? So again, iLottery, right, is not something that exists right now. It would need to be implemented. Folks are estimating that those resources are about $200 million a year when fully implemented, right? And so I think for FY 24, it's pretty realistic to say that revenues from iLottery are probably not going to be $200 million, right? Because we've got to actually implement the policy first. And so with that in mind, I think there are some easy solves for that, right? We've got these resources in the Early Ed Trust Fund. Let's use those for FY 2024. And then once the iLottery program is fully implemented, if it does get fully implemented, we sort of use those revenues in future fiscal years to support that program, right? So I think, again, a little agnostic as to kind of what resources fund the program. I think there are definitely considerations to be made for how you choose to do that. But I think that those can be handled pretty easily. I would also, one other thing about iLottery, right, tend to be kind of volatile revenues, right? Good in kind of good economic times, a little bit lower in bad economic times. And so again, I think easy solve to kind of handle this volatility. We've got this trust fund. Why don't we dedicate a portion of iLottery revenues to that trust fund so that the kind of funding for C3 isn't really dependent on whether iLottery revenues are up or down in one particular year.
And I think that gets to a question that we had from Lauren Cook as well, just about what would happen if C3 grants were supported by iLottery funds and maybe revenue expectations fell short of what people were anticipating. I'm not sure if you have anything else to add there. I think you just spoke to that as well.
Yeah, thank you. And Lauren, feel free to chime in if not, but hopefully I covered that.
Awesome. Another question that we've gotten from Amaris in the chat for advocacy purposes. She's wondering what the higher number between the House and Senate is being proposed for the rate reserve, kind of excluding that $10 million earmark that you mentioned.
What the high number is for the reimbursement rates, excluding the earmark?
Exactly.
The House proposed 100 minus the earmark, it's 90 million.
And then we've gotten a couple questions from Mary Kay in the chat. The first is if there were any chance that the federal government could take back some of the ARPA money that the state still has available.
Yeah, I mean, technically, could they? Yes. I think there are dates in which we have to spend that money by, and if we don't spend that money by that particular date, the federal government does have the right to kind of claw back those funds. I think that the state is well aware of what those deadlines are. There's also about only $300 million left. So it's not a huge amount of money that we need to spend in a short amount of time. And I think because the government is aware, state government is aware of those deadlines, they're likely going to prioritize trying to spend that money first. I think what we've talked about too previously, which might kind of play into this question, is all those funds have been obligated, right? They all have kind of a purpose. Will they actually all get spent is kind of a separate question, right? I think there's absolutely a chance that, hey, we were going to obligate funds to this program, but it turns out we can't spend it in the time allotted, and so we need to reallocate those programs. That is absolutely possible, but I think overall, the state government kind of is aware of those deadlines, knows that they need to prioritize ARPA money, but technically speaking, yes, the federal government does have the ability to take that money, claw that money back if we don't meet those deadlines.
And then another question from Mary Kay in the chat was what happened to the EEC Innovation Fund? I think that might be the high quality EEC trust fund that have been included in the FY23 budget.
Yep.
And did those expenditures need to be approved by the legislature?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So, and I'm sorry for the terminology because I might have kind of confused folks. As Megan mentioned, there's this kind of high quality and affordability early education trust fund. I'm referring to it as the Early Ed Trust Fund because that's a mouthful to kind of repeat over and over again. That kind of high quality early ed trust fund, right, was the one that was established in the FY23 budget. There were some resources deposited into that fund. It was tax revenues, right? And then in an economic development bill, they basically kind of edited that and put, you know, a total of $490 million in that fund. So before this FY24 budget cycle gets like approved, right before the final budget gets approved, we've got $490 million in that early ed trust fund. They are subject to appropriation by the legislature. But those are kind of pretty flexible dollars that could be spent in a variety of different ways. The language is relatively broad. I hope that answers your question, Mary Kay. Any other questions, Megan, from the chat, or any other questions folks want to raise now while we've got a couple minutes left?
No other questions in the chat. We did get one ahead of time. Just wondering if you could speak a bit more to the difference between the provider capital grants that were proposed by the Senate and the current early education and out of school time capital fund. Yeah, sure. So I think the big difference is kind of how those resources are kind of directed or how they would be used, right? So the appropriation in the Senate budget is like it's a direct appropriation for the EEC to spend those dollars on grants. EEC would manage the program, administer the program, get those funds out the door at the speed in which they want to and could. The early education out of school time capital fund is a kind of capital bond authorization, right? It's completely different kind of process for how that money gets authorized to be used, right? What typically happens in those types of programs is they authorize $40 million to be spent on this, you know, early education out of school time capital fund. But because of the way it works, typically the year-to-year budgets for those programs are much less than kind of what the 5-year cost of it would be, right? So in a bond bill, you're authorizing kind of costs over a 5-year period. The early education out of school time capital fund, I think there was a $40 million authorization at one point before the pandemic, but they actually budgeted more like $4 or $5 million a year. It's up to like $6 or $7 million a year. And so what ends up happening oftentimes with those bond authorizations is you actually spend far less than was actually what was authorized, right? Whereas with the Senate budget, this is a direct appropriation. They've got, you know, I think it's $25 million. They can spend $25 million and they can administer that program and do it how they want, right? So I think that would be the difference between the two, is probably how they are able to administer the program, how quickly they can get those funds out the door. I think those are all the questions that we've gotten, other than just a couple of requests to share the presentation after the fact. Yeah, thank you for that. So we're going to send an email out to everyone with the slides and then the recording. I will also say, I think, you know, as I mentioned at the top, Megan has been doing similar presentations on the kind of K through 12 higher ed budget as well.
We'd love to get your feedback. So it is our goal to kind of be able to put together a survey and send it out to you all, get your feedback. Was it timed right? Did we provide the right content? What could be improved? So looking forward to getting that out to you all, and hopefully hearing from you, getting some feedback on these presentations. But thank you so much for being here, and appreciate your time and questions. And please feel free to reach out if anything comes up.